Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the roundtable titled Adapting Cultural Heritage to Climate Change, from Risk Assessment to the Implementation of Solutions. My name is Matthias Sterlich. I'm Professor of Heritage Science at UCL in London and University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and it's my absolute pleasure to moderate this session. My personal research interest has always been at the intersection of heritage, climate, and people, learning that cultural heritage is central to how the humanity deals with global problems, such as climate change. Climate and heritage have always been in a sensitive relationship, and it is important that we see and research not just the effects of climate on heritage, but also how heritage can be a driver for positive change and inspire resilience. We have an exceptional lineup of speakers today, covering not just diverse topics, but also a diversity of contexts and stakeholders, from diverse authorities, policy and decision makers, to experts and managers, all the way to communities living with and embodying heritage. Professor Souza, one of the panelists today, talks about how culture represents the basis for creative economy through cooperation between institutions and communities, for example. And if you allow me, I'll dwell on this for a brief moment. Namely, social sustainability requires communities and individuals to be involved in heritage management processes, not just through formal delegation, but also directly. This increases accountability and promotes equity, diversity, and connectedness. Unfortunately, there are still scarce examples of sustained involvement of citizens in heritage management, and still fewer in heritage science. Due to the urgency imposed by climate change, business as usual is not an option and requires current paradigms to be challenged. The involvement of citizens in decision-making challenges the norms of conservation. Representatives of communities of users of heritage often have well-developed and well-formed views about long-term planning horizons, which appear to be based on intergenerational equity and are similar regardless of the typology of heritage. They are identical to long-term planning horizons often used in large-scale projects aimed at increasing a resilience to climate change. Citizens may thus offer significant insight into resource allocation, for example. And there are examples where, using social science research techniques, citizens, users, were found to have clear views about damage processes that should be prevented, as well as processes that lead to material change that is tolerable, and thus does not require intervention. These have made it clear that understanding the effects of climate change on heritage, as well as understanding of how cultural heritage can help us build resilience, requires not just technological and climate research, but also social science and humanities research. For example, even just to simply observe and record the effects of climate change in numerous and sometimes remote locations, we need to rely on citizens to perform scientific measurements. However, community participation could go further and involve participatory management and participatory policy making, and thus become more meaningful and drive behavioral change. Faced with global challenges such as climate change, the involvement of citizens in heritage management has become a necessity. However, there is currently a significant lack of coherent international effort enabling them to do so. One of today's panelists, Dr. Guzman, will stress the need for inclusion of culture in support of coherency of governance tools, ensuring sustainability and achievement of justice and equity. This requires that solutions, as stressed in the title of this roundtable, are based on a truly interdisciplinary approach, and that heritage science as a field supporting the development of those solutions truly embraces the whole range of natural science, engineering, social science, and humanities research. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker in this session, Dr. Anne Bourgès. Dr. Bourgès is a conservation scientist at the Center for Research and Restoration of Museums of France, and is also Secretary General of ICOMOS France and leads the Climate and Heritage Working Group. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Mattia, and thank you very much for this very nice introduction. And thank you for the organizer for inviting me also to this roundtable. So I'm very pleased to introduce you today the work as we. This is me, yeah, and the roundtable, yes. A transversal approach to tackle climate change on cultural heritage, which is a work proposed by the working group of ICOMOS France, in collaboration also with the working group of Espadon, the Equipex plus Espadon, working on the data collection too. So the working group on climate change by the ICOMOS France is a fresh new group dating from the half of 2021, and making of with different organizers as architects, conservators, and skateboarder, and also scientists working on climate change. So, as had been mentioned this morning, the European Green Deal, the first objective of the European Green Deal is the zero carbon objective in 2050. And as a middle objective, we know very well the Fit 55 that we call this as well, which is a 55 less gas emission in 2030. In this context and in this framework, the construction sector is very concerned. As you can see here in France on the left graph, as the construction sector is the first energy consumer, and this is the actually data dating from 2014, and probably even more less right now, but its dating are really relevant. And since this constatation and this observation, we have adapted a national law in France based on the low carbon emission, which is called the Environmental Law 2020, and applied only since January 2022, and for new construction. So you will see, well, this is not applied for building and for renovation and for heritage, but you will see that it will have big impact on renovation and on heritage actually consideration. So why? Because this new law on construction and on new construction needs and oblige actually the architects to take into account the life cycle assessment of the full building, and not only the full building, but from the extraction of the materials to the building, to the life of the building, and to the recyclability of the building itself. So you see this big, large cycle assessment is kind of very complicated also to probably apply it on heritage, but it's still an objective to do. And then you can see that one of the main impact here of the carbon emission is what we call the operational carbon. And this operational carbon is during the life itself of the building, and all the emission of carbon during the life of the building itself. So we can really observe, and we can underline that this life emission is probably where we can have an impact also in renovation, because our heritage will be the illustration of this life emission also during its life. So, and this is what is shown during the recent research, where you can see already that renovation is already a green action, because we can still keep some pieces of the building, so we are not rebuilding everything. So it's a kind of green action to renovate and to restore. But also the new progress in this kind of research show also that the clear improvement of the gas emission when you renovate it. So it's what we show here. You keep the part of the building, you renovate with a part of the building, and you have a big impact on the renovation of the on the gas emission. Since on the next 50 years. But is this model really applying to and acceptable for heritage nowadays? And not really, because this time scale, which is evaluation of renovation on gas emission on 50 years, is not really what we need to evaluate as well. So when we do renovation, we want to do renovation not only for 50 years, but for much decades and centuries. So the evaluation time is not necessarily the good time. And also the energy calculation software which are used to do these modelings are not really adapted to cultural heritage, because they use average value on the wall for measuring this energy balance. And it's what I wanted to illustrate you today, and the group illustrate today also through different examples from the World Heritage List. And one of the first example is the assessment balance, energy balance of the Le Corbusier apartment, which is also on the World Heritage List. And is considering not only this building as a facade of heat loss, but to considering this building as a complex architectural whole, which is necessary, where it's necessary to measure in an appropriate way by developing specific methods and specific tools. And here, which has been developed here in this case, is the association of the beam modeling that we may know with another modeling, which is energy balance modeling. And when we associate both, we can really have a real integration of all the data also and all the material which are used in the buildings. You may difference the balance and the energy balance of the different materials which are inside the buildings and the different techniques which are used. And so you can really impact the intervention. You can see where the deperdition are localized, and then you have less intervention for a better efficiency. So the idea is to focalize the intervention, to know better the building, to know better the technology which is involved, to be able to have a specific input on the intervention and a better efficiency of it. And by developing this kind of tools, which still need to be developed in a bigger scale, it will be also able to take into account non-passive technique, like such contribution of vegetation in a construction, which are still not taken into account when you do energy balance in a building. They don't take into account the place and the space of the vegetation, which can be the case here that you can see here in this great building of the Casanova de Jean Renaudy in Ivry-sur-Seine. And such development of tools can help to measure the contribution of the vegetation in this kind of buildings, but also at a different scale, and at the scale also at the neighborhood or at the city. Because as we see, and you see, and Jenna Leisner showed it this morning also with the case of the Bordeaux, which is also listed on the World Heritage List, this great town which developed a lot of green approach to refresh also the downtown inside the city. We need to put the scales in correspondence, because they may have an impact also on the building itself, and how we can measure the impact of the vegetation of the city and the link to building itself. So the city highlands, the city cooling energy, and energy saving by the building itself, and to put in relation the public health in the town versus the individual summer comfort, to make the link between the scales. So heritage can be a showcase for innovation by integration data from the past to innovation and to model the future. Is where the data meets the climate change, and we need data also to evaluate climate change and to go further by developing new tools of diagnosis, is what we show here, and by the different tools and modeling and merging different tools of modeling, but also targeting, enhancing the existing, because our heritage is full of existing methods and very virtuous methods and techniques can be emphasized and for sustainable construction solution, and also going to thinking and to innovation. And it has been shown also at the previous roundtable, but new materials and new system can bring a lot of innovation and for restoration, green materials, as we can can be developed like biomaterials or biosources materials, as we can see here also. The earthen material, which is used also from the past and for the ancient culture, but we can be innovating in a new way for the 3D printed models, for instance, for construction, for new construction. So there is a gap, but a bridge to build also together between the past and the future. But the approach to climate change in heritage cannot be limited to carbon objectives. What also we included in our thinking in the ICOMOS group, and integrating this low carbon emission in a more integrated panoptic view of heritage faced to climate change on time scale and space scales. And a good example here is the Climat de Bourgogne, also listed on the World Heritage List, and coming from the natural site. And we have a lot to learn on natural landscape and natural site, because they are the first impacted to climate change. So they develop a lot of methodology also already, and more panoptic, I think, as we should do on buildings and on archaeological site, and that we can be inspired by this methodology, because they will, and they need data also to evaluate, and it's what we need today, to evaluate the impact factors and to evaluate the influence of the climate change on different sites, but also in order to modelize and to have a prediction of the vulnerabilities on a different site, and then to make some management risk management plan in correlation of the vulnerability which has been identified, integrating the low carbon objectives, as we can see this approach in a full life cycle assessment, as this has been previously also said, and then reevaluating the value of this heritage, because it changed over the time, because it has to be adapted because of the climate change. So we need to reevaluate also this patrimonial value. And this is what is done for this kind of example. So our purpose in the group is to identify the needs and responses at each scale, as we saw, from the building to the culture, from the cultural heritage and the natural landscape to the city and the building environment, to create synergy and increase resilience to climate change, to find the bridge, to be able to have emphasis between these different scales, and to show that heritage can be a showcase for innovation, but also a vector for adaptation to climate change. Like it can gather also different communities, which are not only scientists, but which are also the actors in climate, not on climate change, but the actors in heritage in general, which are the visitors and which is the public also, which can be really impacted also through our action on cultural heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'd like to introduce Greta Bruschi, Dr. Greta Bruschi, who's an architect and temporary researcher at IUAV, University of Venice in Italy. She's currently researcher in restoration and tutor at IUAV and guest lecturer in restoration at the University in Udine. Over to you, Greta.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to the organization for this opportunity. I will talk about a case study that is related to the former Eni village in Borca di Cadore, north of Italy, realized by Edoardo Gellner in the 50s. And this case study allows some critical consideration on architecture and landscape scale reflection about climate change and preservation issues. The Eni village was built between the late 50s and the early 60s, thanks to the political capacity and ambition of Enrico Mattei, a businessman, politician and Italian public manager. The village has been projected by Edoardo Gellner together with Carlo Scarpa for some of its parts. And it is a great and complex architectural work. It's a large compound, over 200,000 square meters, made of different structures and built according to innovative criteria in a large wooded area by Mount Antilao, about 10 kilometers from Cortina d'Ampezzo. For almost a decade, from 1955 and 1963, Gellner was engaged in the construction of the village on behalf of Enrico Mattei's Eni. But in 1962, Mattei died after a plane crash, and the impact of the event and the following lack of strength resulted in a partial realization of the original plan. The village is an attempt to create an entirely new and coherent landscape. The main buildings are those of the holiday camp building, La Colonia, the colony, 30,000 square meters, the church, the camping with permanent tent, and 280 one-family cottages. It is an exceptional and unique site in Italy, where the relationship between the aspects of the landscape and natural environment blend with the organic architecture, nowadays almost invaded by vegetation. Gellner planned not only the architecture, but also the external spaces and the urban furnishing. Since the year 2000, the village is property by the company Minotaur, with which Dolomiti Contemporanee was started a collaboration based on a project of cultural and functional valorization of the setting. And in June 2014, it was started Progetto Borca, a specific cultural action on this side. The village is also a case study for another group of research, the Cluster Lab e-Modern, a transdisciplinary research group at UAV University of Venice, which includes among its partners Dolomiti Contemporanee. Me too. And the original site has been described by Gellner as a dry and rocky terrain with snakes and sparse twisted trees, and the lack of water contributed to making it appear inhospitable. Despite this, the valley, in addition to a magnificent view, included a great variety of natural environment. Gellner's idea was to safeguard the exceptionality, beautiful of nature, and developing and improving the damaged areas, so it reshaped the bare slope into an inhabitable environment. So when buildings were finished, he decided to cover the bare rocky area with clods of turf carefully transplanted from the grassy area on the other side of the valley. And the replanted land covered the 12% of the total surface of the area of the village in black in the map. Another remarkable work is related to the construction of a retaining wall in order to reduce the impending character of these walls. They were built with a combination of concrete and local stone. The layout is unusual, and this helps to link this secondary structure to the landscape and to the architecture. So they take on an architectural value in themselves. Gellner was very satisfied with the result, and he said, however, I had considered a point of arrival in the process of generating an anthropic landscape soon turned out to be only the beginning of a phenomenon that led to a radical transformation of Borca from an architectural and site planning event to a naturalistic one. But what happened to the landscape nowadays? The comparison between the panoramic images made by Gellner in 1951 and those realized today show the advanced vegetation in relation to the abandonment of grazing practice. And the village continued to perform its tourist function until 1992, then it was abandoned, so that nature has recovered many spaces without any kind of maintenance. The important anthropic action of redevelopment of the original area, characterized by landslide and hydrogeological risk, has now to face the new challenges arising from climate change. Some images about the storm Valle in October 2018, which affected also the Eni village. The increasingly frequent weather extreme events, as via storm, have highlighted further vulnerabilities of the site, causing more pronounced disruption in the area most transformed by the project, damaging and endangering also many architecture. We see some elements that link the damages with the transformed areas. A reference in the national Italian plan of adaptation to climate change shows that the climate change is, in most of cases, an exasperating factor of past criticality, due in large part to short-sighted planning and management of resources. So it's clear that the planning of maintenance and monitoring activities is a priority at all the scales, territorial, urban, and architectural. Moreover, the variation of environmental parameters is changing the condition of conservation of materials, overlapping with natural aging and degradation. The village is an emblematic case, both with reference to the invention of the landscape, but also in the action of building typing, considering local rural architecture. In this historical architecture, studied in detail by Gellner, as we see in the first images, to design the new ones, we can find an intrinsic resilience to climate change and hazard, considering construction techniques and local materials. This is not possible for contemporary architecture, where we have to considering an adaptation action to preserve them. The debate on safe conservation of the built heritage, characterized by reflection on the occurrence of natural disaster, should reconsider the methods of vulnerability analysis, seismic, hydrogeological, due to the concomitance of several factors that causes phenomena of exaltation, such as the absence of maintenance and the presence of not coherent transformation. As usual, the analysis of the history and of the architecture and cities and their transformation during time is an essential tool to identify vulnerabilities and strengths of this part of cities and architecture. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Luis Antonio Cruz Souza, who's full professor in conservation sciences at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte. He's the president of Antecipa, Brazilian Association for Research in Technology and Heritage Sciences, and the director of SECOR, Center for Conservation and Restoration of Cultural Properties, at the same university. Luis, over to you.
Thank you, Mattia. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. This 10 minutes presentation titled Heritage Science Networks, Contribution to the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Natural and Cultural Heritage Protection is the result of collaborative work. And I would like here to thank my co-authors, Yaciara Froner, Guilherme Michelin, Willie de Barros, and Henry McGee. There is a considerable concern today related to the ability of our current scientific, intellectual, and governmental infrastructure to respond to the emergency issues generated by climate change associated with the demand for sustainable development through a policy of international, regional, and local cooperation, social justice, cultural identity, and environmental protection, determinants for the quality of individual and collective life, are intertwined units. Over the past 50 years, and this is the last slide, over the past 50 years, the global challenges to sustainable development have been driven by a broad set of institutions, reflecting an international debate. In this way, the trinomial preservation of culture, protection of the environment, and economic balance determine the quality of the reflection generated by these institutions. To achieve these aims and objectives, science, education, and government commitment are indispensable. What's the role of heritage science in the field of the United Nations? 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the drafts discussed at the International Conference on Sustainable Cities held in Hangzhou, China in October 2015, it was stated that the culture constitutes an essential investment in the world's future and a precondition to successful globalization processes that take into account the principle of cultural diversity, and also is a key tool for promoting sustainable urban development by preserving the urban identity and the environment, attracting activities and visitors, fostering the development of the creative economy and the quality of life. So, sustainable cultural heritage can be seen as a technical and scientific approach to maintain the physical integrity of a cultural material property, as well as to ensure the expression and the memory of immaterial culture. In the first case, it depends on qualified personnel at all levels and of the conservation science field to support the preservation of material culture, both movable and immovable. In both cases, material and immaterial culture, these actions require legal protection, training, and approach from the heritage science field, so altogether. It is in this context that we would like to introduce the concept of social resilience. Social resilience is the ability to deal with a crisis or adversity based on previously learned cognitive, cultural, and or emotional processes. Resilience exists when, based on previous experiences, the individual or the community uses mental processes, behaviors, and knowledge to promote assets and protect themselves from the negative stress effects of stressors, such as climate change and cultural erasure policies, in search for a potential return to normality. And you'll see at the end why I'm talking about these issues here. The General Assembly of ICOM in Kyoto 2019 has adopted the resolution transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This resolution has resulted in several actions and programs worldwide by several of ICOM institutions. Next year, at the ICOM General Conference in Prague, the ICOM Working Group on Sustainability, of which 3 authors of this presentation are proud to be members of, will present the ICOM's 2030 action plan towards implementing the 2019 Kyoto Resolution on Sustainability. There is no need to reinforce here also the importance of e-commerce, both for the presentation by Dr. Potts in the morning and also by my colleague here in this table. So I'm running to the next. UNESCO 17 Sustainable Development Goals were set up in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly and are intended to be achieved by the year 2030. They are included in a UN General Assembly resolution called the 2030 Agenda, or what's colloquially known as Agenda 2030. I'm not going to go through all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals because of time, but it's very important that we all know about them and that we know them by heart. Next slide. Sorry, it's myself. So I'm sorry, some of my slides are out of sequence, but we had no chance to change them. So that's why sometimes I go. So in Brazil, now, training in conservation of cultural heritage officially started by the beginning of the years 1980s with implementation of regular training courses at the Federal University of Bahia, Immovable Heritage, and at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Movable Heritage, with support from the National Institute for Cultural Heritage. In terms of science and research networks, in the beginning of the years 2000, the Brazilian National Research Council has funded RECICOR, Science and Technology Network for the integrated conservation of cultural heritage between 2001 and 2004. Our laboratory at the Federal University of Minas Gerais was a leader in this project. Recently, based on LACICOR, our laboratory involvement with and within the European networks since 2004, LabStack, EURTech, Charisma, Hyperion Cultural Heritage, and ARIS, Antecipa was created. Antecipa, the Brazilian National Association of Research in Technology and Heritage Science, was established in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, in December 2015, during the event Hyperion BR, which was the first meeting of associated laboratories for heritage science research, and involved the participation of the main Brazilian laboratories that carry out research in the area of conservation science, as well as with the presence of important European researchers and members from the consortium Hyperion CH and ARIS. The directory board of the association, our association, is composed of representatives of professionals and researchers mainly related to the 5 university conservation programs. Conservation programs. Yeah. Antecipa completed its registration process as a legal entity in May 2018. Its aims are to contribute to the promotion of research and preservation of cultural heritage, to support and encourage academic exchange, technical cooperation, professional capacitation, scientific and technical congresses, seminars, conferences, and, between others, to represent the Brazilian scientific community involved with the research and preservation of cultural heritage. Another network we are working with is the ABENDI, Brazilian Association of Non-Destructive Testing and Inspection, which has recently created a technical committee on cultural heritage, which aims at encouraging discussion of protocols, methods, and technologies aimed at diagnosis and monitoring of cultural heritage. It also intends to discuss and elaborate recommended practices considering the cultural heritage built at its various scales. ABENDI was created in, the commission was created in May 2020. And it involves architecture, engineering, geology, history, agronomy, and heritage science. The group includes researchers with relevant performance in the national and international scenario, both in Brazil and elsewhere. I'm going to go through some of the slides because here it's very important to mention the work of ECOM, of which we are part of the working group on sustainability, and also of our colleague, one of the authors, Henry McGee, who's been working with very big production in these themes, and also our works in Brazil with the small communities. So finally, besides the floods, the fires, the landslides, we also have mining, deforestation, which means destructions of minorities, destruction of minorities, small communities, and destruction of knowledge, things we don't even know so far. So my final words are, in Brazil, despite all of the work and efforts we have put into the formation of scientific heritage science and conservation science networks, such as the ones mentioned above, it's still very far from saying that the government has effectively adopted policies and decision-making processes which take in account our contribution. If we think about our recent experience in Brazil in dealing with the COVID pandemic, given the importance that the Brazilian society does to vaccines and how important they are to the public health, despite the government not giving importance to vaccination campaigns, the Brazilian society still did very good, very well, because of the experience the society and the health organizations in the country have with the vaccination campaign. So that's the example I want to use, how important to have cultural heritage education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Our next speaker is Dr. Egusquiza Aitziber, who is senior researcher at Tecnalia in Spain, and is coordinator of the Horizon 2020 project on sustainable historic environment, holistic reconstruction through technological enhancement and community-based resilience, and is head of a project that established the sustainability standard for the Galapagos Islands. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. First, I would like to apologize for my voice. I'm going to make my best, but it's not its best. And it's a pleasure to be here, really, to present this task force that we, Shelter Project, with another two projects, Archiperion, established, and it's called Towards Climate Neutral and Resilient Historic Urban District. So I'm not going to get long in this, because the best part of being almost the end of the day is that you can skip some of the context. So we know climate change is serious, it's dramatic, it's urgent, and according to the last report, it's even more serious, even more dramatic, and it's even more urgent. But okay, we know that. And also, I think I don't have to convince you about the role of cultural and historic sites in climate change adaptation. Because if not, we will not be here. No, so let us skip this, and let's talk more about the task force that was established by the Horizon 2020 projects, ARC, Hyperion, and Shelter, and coordinating the last one. But also we try to follow earlier projects that Storm, Heracles, and other than out here. And it's nice that Yusutina is here because he has presented this project in the morning. So what we try to do, what all the task force try to do, collaboration among stakeholders, adoption of solutions, exchange best practices, increase awareness and role of historic areas. But also we want to coordinate efforts on climate resilience in accordance with protection and preservation of heritage. Not only in heritage field, because that is important, but also we have to find synergies with contemporary and urban districts. And also, as we have been talking during the day, also we have to support the renovation wave in the new European Bauhaus, that I think cultural heritage has a lot to say here. So objectives, accelerating the dissemination of advanced harmonizing strategies regarding urban planning, assessing and monitoring impacts and risk, and also develop these strategies for and with local communities, that is co-creation, knowledge exchange, and discussion among research project and initiative, in order to try to give a coordinated input to European policy processes. So we have three thematic areas. The first one is about resilience strategies, how we want to align climate change, cultural heritage, disaster risk management, and urban planning, because sometimes they have opposite objectives, and we have to try to reconcile it. And as we already talked about that also, how we can introduce intrinsic resilience in this whole plan. The second one is about assessing, monitoring, evaluating risk and resilience. which are the indicators, the data sources? That is a really big question. But also, what are the methods that has to be transparent and replicable? And they have to work at different scale. Are the same method? Are different methods? I mean, there is a lot of discussion here also. And finally, how to engage local communities and how to target solutions to ensure the impacts of climate change and disaster and the benefits of solution also are equitably distributed. So we are coordinating together this task force, but we are rotating who is leading, so that is why today I'm here. If not, it will be another of my colleagues. And the technical core is the partners from the different projects, but also we want to invite everybody. All the practitioners, decision makers, policy actors, because we want to be a discuss that is open. Also, all the initiatives, because similar to these initiatives are most, and today we have been talking about that. I think all these initiatives also have to talk together and try to open the discussion, but also coordinate the result that we are doing. I think that is something that, symposiums like today's now can help to that. So we have the sister project. They call sister project for the ones that they don't know, because they were funded under the same topic, resilience and sustainable reconstruction of historic areas to cope with climate change and hazard events. They start mid-June, so we are reaching our third year, and all the three of them have a budget around 6 million. ARC, that is coordinated by Fraunhofer, has Bratislava, Camerino, Hamburg, and Valencia's case studies. Hyperion, coordinated by ESS, has Granada, Rhodes, Tonsberg, and Venice. And finally, Salter, we have 5 case studies: Ravenna, Seferian-Hisar, Dordrecht, Baixas, Lima, and Sava River Basin. So we have 14 case studies in order to improve and maximize the replicability. And I'm going a little fast because we wanted to arrive to here, to some of the conclusions that we have gathered so far. We have had 2 rounds, and so far 2 meetings, working meetings. And the first one was 1 year ago, and I'm really happy that people was there is today here, Johanna, Andrew, Giuseppina. It's really nice to see you here after almost 1 year. And back then we tried to really put 3 different perspectives in the issue: the policy perspective, what are the scientific gaps, but also what are the on-the-ground challenges. The second meeting was in December. In this way, we were working with mirror boards in each of the thematic areas, trying to see what were the scientific problems, the practitioner problem, and trying to find the solution that can link all of this. I'm going to make a spoiler, but we talk very little about solutions, so we find more about challenge and about problems than really solutions. So maybe that is the work that we need to do in the next months. So the first challenge, data and assessment. I mean, we have been talking about that all the morning also. How we are going to do with so many data, because I think for first time in history we have too many data and not enough data. How we are going to handle with this large amount of data, not only technically, because technically that is going to be solving, but how we are going to make some kind of sense of this data. Because if we are just thinking in artificial intelligence to make data of this big, I think, for me, at least for me, it scares a little this perspective. And also how we can downscale complex approaches. How we can put together complexity, usability, reliability. I mean, all of us, we are in cultural heritage years ago embracing complexity. We know how complex it is. We know how we have to talk about complexity. But then we have to make usable methodologies, usable approaches, useful tools, and it has to be reliable. How can do that? I think it's not solution for that. I think it's something that we have to work during always maybe. And also how we are going to include cultural heritage in their most comprehensive way. I'm talking about intangible heritage, natural heritage, tangible heritage, but also rural areas, small heritage, not officially denominated heritage. How we are going to include all of this in the equation? How we are going to assess consequences and damages of the hazards when we don't have even proper databases of cultural heritage losses after natural hazards? How we are going to do it? Again, too many data and not enough data. The other was fragmentation. Fragmentation at local level, at national level, at regional level. We have cultural heritage, climate change, urban planning in different ministries, in different departments in the municipalities. And it's not clear that it's a priority. We are here and for all of us it's priority, but it's not clear that no, in the mainstream policies it's a priority. This morning I've been talking about it was not even in the Green Deal. We don't have even a common vocabulary. Then maybe you can use combined approach like sustainability and resilience. We have to combine approach because we cannot be fighting different wars in the same way, in the same moment. Local knowledge, again, we have talked a lot about that, and in the last IPCC report was highlighted how important it is, but how we are going to integrate that, how we are going to be operative, this local knowledge. And that is very linked with governance, because, I mean, maybe it's my impression, but sometimes I think that we have bored the stakeholders. We go there, we want to co-create knowledge, but we are always to the same stakeholders. And we are competing between each other, no? And they are skeptical because sometimes we go, we ask for information and we never go back. We have to introduce not only their knowledge, we have to introduce their values, how they prioritize, how it's important for them. Also, what is their perception of risk? That we'll have to introduce together with awareness, of course, and training. And today, this morning, we were talking about skill and craft that are so important. We have to make believe, then again, that they are part of the solution, but we have to make also institutions to accept that citizens are part of the solution. And the last one, because I think I'm in time, the role of cultural heritage. And I think that, Andrew, you were very, very strong about that in the kickoff meeting. I remember about saying that culturality is a powerful contribution in the resilience narrative and you have to use it. And I think culture as solution and creativity as a tool for problem solving is something that we have to put in value. We have to say that there is something that maybe sometimes we are overlooking it. So we have to produce culture-based strategies. And just to finish, the next steps, we are drafting a paper to try to share this and also to get inputs about this. And we want to make a presential meeting around June, July to share the conclusion. Everybody is invited to that. That is an open initiative. So here is my email, but I mean, in our web pages you can find. So if you are interested, just write to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aiziber. You've highlighted several issues that are so central to this roundtable, and I'm sure we'll return to them later in the discussion. Our last speaker is Paloma Guzman, who's researcher at the Department of Heritage and Society at NICU, the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research. She obtained her PhD from the Eindhoven Technical University in the Netherlands, while her research focuses on the integration of cultural heritage in sustainable development, particularly in urban contexts. Paloma, over to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for being here. Today I'm also presenting on the name of my colleague Kathy Daly, who is also sitting here among us. And the name of the presentation is the project High Clip, which is a project undertaken within the Climate Heritage Network, which, as it has been explained earlier before, aims to help mainstream arts, culture, and heritage into climate plans at different levels. We, together with Kathy, we led the research undertaken within the working group number 4, which was the only group that actually did research and a systematic assessment of planning climate plans and their integration of cultural resources. And there is a report that was presented at COP26 that it's available on the Climate Heritage Network website for your consideration. So we have talked before why should cultural heritage resources be included, and I'm just going to point out here that from the climate science, it has been said that to address climate change, it is required that all sectors of society take action and collaborate towards sustainable solutions. Yet planning is still influenced by sectorized organization, which is separated by scientific silos. And also we have a situation with cultural heritage that it can be understood as those monuments or elements that have recognition or receive protection from a national or a governmental entity, but also those resources that are more embedded in our local communities that often are not identified within our government mechanisms. So, of course, the inclusion and exclusions of sectors and actors, as it has been said before, in a planning process risk perpetuating business as usual and perpetuate unsustainable patterns. However, climate scientists have already recognized that those climate strategies that consider cultural resources may be more successful at producing innovative collaborations to localize climate goals. So the Hype-Clip project was a multidisciplinary methodology to assess the integration of cultural resources, but also the role of the cultural sector in planning. We tested this methodology in a pilot project that considered 9 countries and plans covering the national and regional plan that you can just see yourself. So what are climate plans? So these are strategies top-down designed for implementing global climate goals into local context. These are comprehensive roadmaps used by governments to organize their action. They identify the sectors and actors responsible to take adaptation and mitigation actions, and they also set which special context should be prioritized in terms of urban, rural, and other environments. Our methodology consists on 3 dimensions. One is the cultural heritage conceptualizations, asking which cultural resources are being included. The second is the climate policy context, which policy contexts are including cultural resources and how these are being prioritized. And dimension 3 is the governance treatment. So which planning levels and are identified synergies between sectors. So I'm just going to go quickly through dimension 1 just to say that we understand cultural heritage both in the material and intangible elements of it as considered by UNESCO standardized definitions and different categories. In dimension 2, we just understand how actions tend to align into mitigation actions or adaptation, or how these are tending into rural natural landscapes or cities and urban settlements. Dimension 3, however, is probably the most important because it speaks about the technical aspects of how plans are being are composed. We're understanding 3 main levels. The first one is the vision, where government states where do they want to go in the future, and it's called the strategic level. The second is the actions. How do we get to that future, which is the operationalization of actions. And the last one is the measure, how we assess and monitor the progress that is being done. And in this 3 level, we want to understand which cultural heritage resources and values are being recognized and integrated, and what is the role given to the cultural sector in terms of the management of this. We can also say that filling into these 3 levels, we can then talk of a full integration of a sector. So if we can see more integration of the 3 levels of the cultural elements, then we can actually talk that it's a good practice. So our pilot project aims to give in this way a state of the practice, just to see how far are we in this integration I just mentioned. We identify 17 specific actions integrating cultural resources, mostly tending to adaptation. And these are, you can see that the table shows the average of frequency across climate plans, of which one are commonly found across plans, but also the times that cultural resources as being mentioned. So we can also see how this says the behavior of these actions and how much these can also be identified for assessing the vulnerability of societies. These 17 actions are also an entry point for the cultural sector practitioners or academics to understand on how to mobilize their sector and relate to planners, but also climate scientists. So, as I said before, talking about the different planning levels, we identify, for example, those levels that remain only at the strategic level, that only mentions how a government recognizes in their visions the importance of for example, cultural values. This we saw, for example, in countries that have indigenous people and have an important role in managing environmental resources, like in Norway, Colombia, and New Zealand, where they are talking about the importance of indigenous knowledge to manage their forest, for example. However, no actions were actually found on it. So this only reminds on what we think is important. Some actions that cover only 2 levels are, for example, those plans that are based their methodologies on integrative approaches. For example, socio-ecological systems, ecosystem services, and landscape-based approach. These methodologies recognizes the link between culture and nature in different contexts, and also recognize the role for society. And the operational or the strategies, the main actions that are included within these activities are, for example, the development of databases and documentation methods of the cultural resources being affected, developing or establishing risk assessments in the different contexts where the resources are being affected, and also staff training in other sectors to manage cultural resources. Lastly, those actions that cover the 3 levels of planning are, for example, the incentives to build partnerships between sectors, plans that require the climate heritage plans to inform climate policies affecting tangible and intangible cultural resources. In these plans, they are actually requiring from their cultural sector to develop this information for them. Operational level is covered then by the cultural sector developing sectorial plans, such as retrofitting plans or disaster risk management plans, and other risk and vulnerability assessment for cultural landscapes or other types of cultural heritage. Related to this, we see some indicators already, which are mainly the quantification of heritage assets affected by climate change, number of new regulations in a prioritized cultural sector, for example, crafts, that is usually not the most common cultural sector included in climate, but some countries are already doing it. Public perceptions of values of coastal sites, for example, affected by climate change, the number of visits to forests and woodlands, and of course, ecological services for community health and quality of life. So here you can see that indicators are not necessarily related only on the conservation of the material aspects of heritage, but we can start to see a bridge with other sectors and scientific fields. What we learned, quickly, I hope I have time, is that we saw that the conservation of material heritage is a main concern in climate planning, especially at national levels. However, in general, cultural heritage resources remain generalized. There is no specification of categories, for example. Also, cultural values in climate plan are recognized more for their social significance rather than the historic value or aesthetic value that is mostly what is leading in the cultural sector. And in terms of governance treatment, we saw that there are emerging bridges beyond the cultural sectors for climate action, and that intangible heritage aspects are increasingly acknowledged by sectors such as agriculture, land planning, natural resource management, and others, but there is a big absence of the museums, arts, and creative industries, for example. In this exercise, we also saw that there is a cognitive challenge between the strategic actors and sectors, and this is based on scientific biases. We have discussed this also in different ways. What we saw is that there is a dichotomy where there is more recognition of cultural resources by other sectors, but then the cultural sector doesn't necessarily relate to what these other sectors, or they are not even informed or aware of the work of other sectors are doing in terms of climate. And then the sectors that are including these intangible elements of heritage do not necessarily recognize the need to include experts on different methods that can help them assess what they are actually saying it is important. So we say the acknowledgement of cultural expertise methods and knowledge for cultural heritage management is still very much absent in climate planning. Finally, local climate planning is challenged to be more explicit in the inclusion of specific cultural resources in relation to their spatial context and climate-related challenges, but also the identification of the social and cultural values attributed by social groups. In the Climate Heritage Network, we believe that the explicit inclusion of cultural heritage categories can serve as an indicator for social resilience, because we believe that including cultural heritage, it helps localizing global climate goals. It also fosters principles of justice and equity, but also, and what is particularly important, is that it minimizes technocratic solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. I realize that given the complexity of issues that you addressed, it was very difficult to squeeze everything into 10 minutes, but we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I was told by the organizers that we can perhaps spend a little bit more time with discussion, because this is the last session of today. So if we have any questions in the audience or online, that would be awesome. But if not, and to get us going, perhaps given how diverse your backgrounds are, I was wondering what your thoughts were on what, in relation to climate change, heritage science could learn from other fields. What is your experience in that? Any of you, yeah.
Yes, why not? I mean, one of the things that I invite a little for environmental science is their accountability, no? How they have, I mean, their problem is similar to us, no? How to make important something that is not only monetary, no? That it's important for well-being, for people, has some significance, but it's not so clear, no? And with ecosystem services, they have tried to put numbers in this, no, in benefits, income benefits. And I think cultural heritage should do something more deep in this sense. And it's true that there are cultural services, but I think they didn't have been done from cultural field. So I think there we have a work to convince everybody about the benefits and the co-benefits of about everything that is valuable for well-being, for for humanity in general, but put some kind of numbers. I don't say that has to be monetary numbers, no, but we have to put, because also it will be more easier to then after justify investing in climate change adaptation or disaster risk management. So I think, yes, we have to make an effort in putting numbers to what is valuable in cultural heritage.
Fantastic, thank you. Any more thoughts, Paloma?
In terms of materializing the knowledge on cultural heritage sciences, for example, into planning, I think what is still very much missing is a more proactive approach from the cultural heritage sector in terms of looking at what other planning agendas are doing and how they can actually contribute to that. often we saw some of our colleagues that are not necessarily aware of the agenda of the neighbor sector that actually has an incidence on their work on conserving. And I think this is very important, that it has to be tackled somehow.
Anne?
Yes, and perhaps there is, I think, a big bridge also to link between innovating industry and what we know in our heritage. There is many examples of know-how also in our techniques in heritage, which can be in buildings, but are also mostly in buildings, but also in archaeology also area, and we can emphasize it and go to innovation process and to go to industry to make this link, I think, from the past to the new innovation tools and to be able to apply, to be able to have this new evaluation tools also for climate change, I think. So there is this bridge to reach between the past and the modern time, and to go to industry, to see the industrial, and to go to new involvement and new industry.
Thank you very much. I believe we have a question in the audience. Dr. Leisner?
You were asking about economic numbers, and I think it is still very, very important to put numbers, economic numbers, on the cultural heritage. We have discussed in our expert group that it is important. We don't know what is the full scale of costs, of economic costs, when we are losing the cultural heritage. And I refer to the very famous Stern report from 2006. That was a revolution, because it was the first time that we were given numbers, what it costs us if we do not react against climate change, and if we react. And that was the first time that the political leaders really took the topic of climate change serious. And this kind of, let's say, Stern report for cultural heritage is something what we need urgently. We need a risk map all over Europe, so that the decision makers can easily see what is at risk, not only by sea level rise. We have maps from that, but for the totality of our cultural heritage. And if we have these numbers, and if we demand it, and the numbers we have already, we must communicate better. And this is still something which we are not doing, let's say, to the extent we should do it. It goes to museums, it goes to monuments keepers, it goes to everybody working in cultural heritage. We are still too silent.
Thank you very much, Johanna. As eloquent as ever, thank you. Is there a response to this? Do we have the tools to respond to Johanna's call?
I think now all the information that we have about satellite and so still is untapped. I mean, everything is not going to be solved by satellite. I mean, that is also, but I think there is a problem about structuration of data, no? Because I think if you don't have a structured database about what we are losing each time that something happens, you cannot model, no, how happened. I mean, there is information is there, but data is there, but sometimes I have the feeling that we from the field, we should target more which kind of information should be gathered and structured. And I think there still, we are hoping that satellite data will, and I'm very fan of satellite data, but satellite data and machine learning is not going to solve our problems. We have to use these tools, but we have to target more how we want to make sense of this data and which data has to be gathered. And I think there is some kind of, we have to together say, okay, this data is important, let's gather it this time that something happened. And there are a lot of, I mean, in cultural always sector always has been this way. There are a lot of initiative, people try to do it, and then there is a project, and the project finishes, and then no. So how we? I mean, I think we should try to keep this momentum that sometimes we get, and we're very happy. Let's do this, no? A little in more sustainable way, and target a little more, especially. Which data are important, and after how we can interpret them.
Thank you very much. And any other thoughts?
And I think we need to work on this multi-scale approach also, so from the data, the satellite data, but also to come back to the monument, to the site itself, and to see how it behaves through because we can have a changement, we can have a big gap between what we have at the climate change at the big scale and what happened really on the scale of the site itself. So we have microclimate also, we have different materials, we have different behavior. They will decay differently also faced to the climate. So this is what we need to assess also.
Any other thoughts, Paloma?
I would like just add that like many times in science, the innovation actually doesn't come from inventing something new, but rather than using something that has done in using a methodology or an idea from another discipline or incorporated into with a new perspective, with a new way. Just when you learn your toys to your neighbor, sometimes you don't like it very much because you think it's being mistreated. But sometimes, then this innovation can happen. And I think the heritage academic sector really would benefit by making more links with other sectors to actually make. Also, that we can create numbers, but if they doesn't mean anything in a context, it doesn't really matter.
Thank you very much. I think the time's up, so thank you very much for attending this session. I think we learned a lot from our speakers. And thank you for connecting the human and the technology and innovation in society. I'm told that we're now invited across the courtyard for a drinks reception. So I'm hoping to see everyone there. Thank you very much.